The sound came first, a crack. Sharp, metallic, unmistakable, like a rifle shot breaking through the pre-dawn silence of the Anzio beachhead. Corporal Daniel Kovacs froze beneath the Bailey Bridge, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog that clung to the Mussolini Canal. The beam found it immediately, a jagged split running through the main girder, a dark line spreading across the steel like lightning frozen in metal, 12 inches long, maybe more, and growing. Before you go, tell me, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far these forgotten stories are reaching. And if this story made you stop and think, even for a moment, hit that subscribe button. February 28, 1944, 5:45 in the morning. The air smelled of wet clay, diesel fumes, and the acrid residue of German artillery that had pounded the perimeter all night. Kovacs' breath came in short bursts, visible in the cold. His gloves were caked with mud. His knees ached from crouching in freezing water beneath the span. Above him, the bridge groaned. Not the normal creak of expansion joints or the protest of metal under wind. This was different, deeper. A sound that meant failure. Kovacs pressed his hand against the girder. Cold, solid, but the vibration told another story. The fracture was propagating, spreading through fatigued steel that had endured too much weight, too many crossings, too many days of shell fire and unstable ground. "Kovacs," a voice called from the eastern approach. "What's the status?" Private Eddie Moran, 19 years old, farm kid from Iowa, voice cracking with nerves. "Hold position," Kovacs called back. His throat was dry. "Don't let anyone on the bridge." "Sir, the Shermans are rolling up now. Captain Hale says—" "I said hold." Kovacs swept the flashlight beam along the underside of the span. The Bailey Bridge had been erected in 36 hours, built by exhausted engineers under mortar fire, using prefabricated steel panels trucked in from Naples. It was rated for 40 tons. A Sherman tank weighed 33. 12 Shermans were lined up on the eastern bank, engines idling, waiting to cross, waiting to punch through the German line at Aprilia and break the bloody stalemate that had turned Anzio into a graveyard. 400 tons of armor, on a bridge held together by welds that had never been inspected, on ground that shifted like quicksand, across a canal that the Germans would shell the moment they saw movement. Kovacs tilted his head, listening. The engines rumbled louder, closer. He traced the fracture with his fingertips. It started at a weld joint between two panel sections, where the original crew had worked too fast, too desperate. The crack ran through the lower flange of the main longitudinal girder, the backbone of the entire structure. If it failed, the bridge wouldn't sag. It would collapse instantly. He thought of Jimmy Delgado, burned alive in a half-track outside St. Lo. He thought of Frank Murray, vaporized by a mine near Salerno. Not again. Kovacs pulled back, wiped his forehead, and climbed onto the muddy embankment. Captain Raymond Hale stood near the lead Sherman, clipboard in hand, face set in the hard lines of a man under pressure from higher command. "Well," Hale barked. "Sir, the main girder has a critical fracture. If we send armor across—" "I didn't ask for a lecture, Corporal. I asked for a status." Kovacs hesitated. "It's not safe." Hale's jaw tightened. "Not safe or not rated?" "Both." The captain glanced at his watch. 5:48. Orders were clear. The attack started at 6 AUG, synchronized with artillery barrages, air support, infantry advances across the entire front. If the tanks didn't cross now, the entire northern thrust would collapse. The Germans would reposition. The window would close. Hale stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Kovacs, I don't have time for worst-case scenarios. Tell me straight, will it hold or not?" Kovacs looked past him, toward the line of Shermans. Lieutenant Frank Rossi sat in the lead tank, turret hatch open, scanning the tree line with binoculars. Rossi had a wife in Detroit, a daughter he'd never met. "Sir," Kovacs said quietly, "if we send them across as is, the bridge will fail, probably on the third or fourth tank, maybe sooner." Hale exhaled slowly. "Can you fix it?" "Not in 15 minutes. "Then what do you suggest? We dismantle the entire span and rebuild? That takes 14 hours. "We don't have 14 hours. "We don't have 1 hour." Kovacs said nothing. His mind raced. There was a way, maybe, something he'd been working on at night, something no one knew about, something that wasn't in any manual. But if it failed, a sharp whistle cut the air. Incoming artillery, distant but closing. The Germans had spotted the assembly. They were ranging in. Hale grabbed Kovacs by the shoulder. "Make a decision, Corporal, right now." Kovacs stared at the bridge. At the crack he could no longer see but could still hear in his mind, spreading like a fault line through steel. Behind him, a piece of metal, a rivet sheared loose by stress, dropped into the canal with a soft splash. The bridge wasn't going to hold. To understand why a single bridge mattered so much, you have to understand Anzio. And to understand Anzio, you have to understand failure. On January 22, 1944, Operation Shingle had looked like genius. Over 36,000 Allied troops and 3,000 vehicles landed on the beaches near Anzio and Nettuno, 60 kilometers south of Rome. Amphibious assault, total surprise. The German defenses were thin, scattered. The road to Rome lay open, but Major General John P. Lucas, commanding 6th Corps, hesitated. Instead of pushing inland immediately, he consolidated the beachhead. He built supply depots. He waited for reinforcements. He followed doctrine, and while he waited, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, acted. Within days, 8 German divisions surrounded the Allied beachhead. What was supposed to be a breakthrough became a siege. By mid-February, the Anzio beachhead was a death trap. 50,000 Allied soldiers pinned into a narrow strip of coastal land, barely 15 kilometers deep and 25 wide. The Germans held the high ground, the Alban Hills to the north, giving them perfect observation for artillery. Every road, every supply dump, every hospital tent was in range. The shelling never stopped, day and night. German 88-meter guns, Nebelwerfers, and heavy mortars pounded the beachhead. Soldiers dug in. They lived in mud. They slept in flooded foxholes. They died in their sleep when shells found them. Casualty rates climbed. 7,000 killed. 36,000 wounded. Morale shattered. On February 16th, the Germans launched their strongest counterattack yet. A massive armored thrust aimed at splitting the beachhead in half and driving the Allies into the sea. For 3 days, the line nearly broke. American infantry fought from trenches, ditches, and ruins. Tank destroyers fired until their barrels glowed. The Germans came within 4 kilometers of the beaches before the attack stalled, bled white by American artillery and sheer desperation. Lucas was relieved of command. Major General Lucian K. Truscott took over on February 23rd. His orders were simple: hold the line, rebuild strength, and prepare for a breakout. That breakout was scheduled for February 28th. The plan was aggressive. Simultaneous armored thrusts at 3 crossing points over the Mussolini Canal, a drainage channel that ran east-west through the middle of the beachhead. The goal: punch through German defenses at Aprilia, a cluster of fascist-era factory buildings the soldiers grimly called the Factory, then push north toward Cisterna and cut Highway 7, the main supply artery for German forces. If it worked, the stalemate would break. If it failed, Anzio would become another Gallipoli, a historical footnote written in blood. Everything depended on mobility, on getting armor across the canal. But by February 27th, 2 of the 3 planned crossing points were compromised. German commandos had destroyed one bridge with demolition charges. Artillery fire had collapsed another. That left one viable route: the Bailey Bridge near Aprilia, hastily erected by the 36th Engineer Combat Regiment. The bridge Kovacs now stood beneath. It had been built in 36 hours by exhausted men working under mortar fire. The ground beneath it, soft clay waterlogged from winter rains, was never properly surveyed. The steel panels were bolted and welded in darkness. Inspection was minimal. Time didn't allow for perfection, but it was certified, stamped, approved by Captain Raymond Hale, who had followed every regulation, checked every specification, and signed off on the structure because the manual said it was sound. What the manual didn't account for was Anzio mud. The clay shifted constantly, settling unevenly, stressing joints that were supposed to remain static. Over 10 days, the bridge had carried supply trucks, jeeps, artillery tractors, and light armor. Each crossing added microscopic damage. Welds fatigued, rivets loosened, hairline cracks appeared. Kovacs had reported the first fracture 3 days earlier. Hale dismissed it. "Bridges don't fail, Corporal. Your nerves do." Now the fracture was 12 inches long and spreading, and 12 Sherman tanks weighing a combined 400 tons were lined up to cross in 15 minutes. At 5:52 a.m., inside a temporary command post, a sandbagged dugout 200 meters behind the bridge, Truscott's operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Everett, stood over a field map, marking positions with a grease pencil. "Status on northern crossing?" he asked. A signals officer held a field telephone to his ear, listening. His face went pale. "Sir, line's dead. We've lost contact with the bridge." Everett looked up sharply. "Dead how? Could be shelling. Could be the wire got cut. Either way, we're blind." Everett cursed under his breath. He checked his watch. 5:53. 7 minutes to H hour. Can you raise them on radio? Negative. Radio silence protocol. They won't break it unless another officer burst through the dugout entrance, breathing hard. Sir, German artillery is ranging in on the assembly area. We've got 2 minutes, maybe 3, before they bracket the crossing. Everett stared at the map. The entire northern thrust depended on armor getting across that bridge, getting across now, before German guns zeroed in and turned the approach into a killing field. He had no communication with the engineers, no way to confirm the bridge was ready, no way to delay the attack. Air support was already inbound. Artillery batteries were firing prep barrages across the line. The attack was happening, with or without confirmation. Everett grabbed the field telephone, cranked the handle, and tried again. Static. He slammed it down. Send a runner, he ordered. Tell Captain Hale the attack proceeds as planned. Armor crosses at 0600, no delays. The runner saluted and sprinted into the fog. But by the time he reached the bridge, the message would be irrelevant, because at 5:54 a.m., Corporal Daniel Kovacs made a decision that no manual had prepared him for. Back at the bridge, Hale was shouting into a dead field phone, shaking it as if anger could resurrect the severed line. Kovacs stood 10 feet away, staring at the water. Lieutenant Frank Rossi climbed down from his tank and approached. Kovacs, we're out of time. I need a yes or no. Kovacs turned. Rossi was young, 26, with a thin mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He was a good officer, calm, fair, the kind of man who looked out for his crew. Frank, Kovacs said quietly, if you roll onto that bridge right now, it might hold, or it might drop you into the canal. Rossi nodded slowly. What are the odds? I don't know. Guess. Kovacs thought about the fracture, the stress calculations he'd done in his head, the way the steel had sounded when he tapped it. 50-50, maybe less. Rossi exhaled. Behind him, his crew waited. 4 men, all of them looking at Kovacs. Is there another way? Rossi asked. There might be, Kovacs said, but it's not approved. It's not in any manual. And if it fails, it's on me. Hale turned, phone still in hand. What are you talking about, Corporal? Kovacs met his eyes. Sir, I can reinforce the bridge. I've been working on something. It'll take 5 minutes to activate, but it's unauthorized. Hale's face flushed. Unauthorized? You've been modifying a certified structure without permission. Yes, sir. That's a court-martial offense. I know. Hale stared at him. The distant rumble of German artillery grew louder. Shells were walking closer, probing for targets. Rossi stepped forward. Captain, I don't care if it's authorized or not. If Kovacs says he can make this bridge safe, I believe him. Hale looked at the line of tanks, at the fog, at his watch. 5:56, 4 minutes. He turned back to Kovacs. If this fails, you'll be buried under the wreckage. You understand that? Yes, sir. Hale nodded once. Do it. Kovacs didn't wait. He dropped into the mud, crawled beneath the bridge, and reached for the canvas tarp he'd hidden 3 nights ago. Underneath was a splice the Army had never seen. Daniel Kovacs was born in the shadow of steel. Pittsburgh, 1920, the year the city's mills ran day and night, forging the backbone of America's industrial power. His father, Istvan Kovacs, had arrived from Hungary in 1912 with nothing but calloused hands and a willingness to work. He found a job as an ironworker, riveting I-beams on the skyscrapers and bridges rising along the 3 rivers. Istvan didn't speak much English. He didn't need to. Steel was a universal language. Danny grew up watching his father leave before dawn and return after dark, clothes stained with grease and rust, fingers wrapped in bandages from burns and cuts. But Istvan never complained. He came home, kissed Danny's mother, ate dinner in silence, and then, always, walked to the small workshop behind their row house. There, under a single bare bulb, he would teach Danny how to read metal by sound, how to judge a weld by its color, how to measure twice, cut once, and check 3 times before trusting your life to a joint. Steel does not lie, Istvan would say in his broken English, tapping a beam with a hammer. But men who build with steel, they lie all the time. They rush, they guess, they hope. You must know. By the time Danny was 16, he was working summer jobs on bridge crews, climbing high above the Allegheny River, riveting beams alongside men twice his age. He learned to read blueprints, calculate load angles, and spot a weak joint before the inspector did. He wasn't the strongest worker, he wasn't the fastest, but he was precise, methodical, the kind of worker foreman trusted with the critical stuff, the joints that couldn't fail, the welds that held everything together. In 1938, Danny graduated high school. His mother wanted him to attend college, maybe study engineering. But the Depression still gripped the country, and college cost money the Kovacs family didn't have. So Danny went to work full-time, joining the Ironworkers Union, building bridges and factories across western Pennsylvania. He was good at it, really good. By 1941, at 21, He was earning a reputation as the guy you called when something needed to be done right the first time. Then came December 7th, Pearl Harbor. Danny enlisted 2 weeks later, not because he was eager for war, he wasn't. Not because he hated the Germans or Japanese, he didn't know any. He enlisted because his country needed builders, and building was what he knew. The Army assigned him to the engineers. By the spring of 1942, he was at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, learning military bridge construction, demolition, and mine clearance. He excelled. His instructors noted his exceptional attention to detail and calm under pressure. But Danny didn't care about the praise. He cared about one thing: making sure his work didn't kill anyone. Because in war, unlike in Pittsburgh, there were no second chances. A weak rivet didn't just mean a bridge sagged, it meant men drowned. A miscalculated load didn't just mean a project delay. It meant tanks fell, burned, and their crews died screaming. Danny had seen it happen. North Africa, 1943. A pontoon bridge his unit built across a wadi near Kasserine. The engineers who assembled it had rushed, exhausted after 3 days of combat. One anchor cable wasn't secured properly. When a half-track crossed, the cable snapped. The bridge twisted. The half-track rolled into the water. Danny pulled one man out, just one. The other 3 drowned, trapped inside as the vehicle filled with mud and river water. One of them was Jimmy Delgado, a kid from El Paso who talked constantly about his mother's tamales and his plan to open a restaurant after the war. Danny never forgot the sound of Jimmy pounding on the inside of the half-track as it sank. After that, Danny stopped trusting other people's work. He checked everything himself: welds, bolts, cables, anchor points. He carried a steel tape measure, his father's from the old country, worn smooth from decades of use, and measured every critical joint twice, 3 times, until he was certain. Other engineers mocked him. "Kovacs, you're slower than my grandmother." "We don't have time for your paranoia, Danny." But Danny didn't care. He had seen what happened when you cut corners. Sicily, 1943. Another bridge, this one over the Simeto River. Danny spent an extra hour reinforcing a support beam that looked fine but sounded wrong when he tapped it with his hammer. His sergeant yelled at him for delaying the column. 2 days later, German bombers hit the bridge. It held just long enough for an entire infantry company to cross before collapsing. If Danny hadn't reinforced that beam, it would have failed mid-crossing. No one apologized for yelling at him. By the time Danny landed at Salerno in September 1943, he had a reputation, not as a hero, as a perfectionist. A guy who followed the manual to the letter, who never improvised, who trusted procedure over instinct. That reputation followed him to Anzio. On the night of February 26, 1944, Danny couldn't sleep. He lay in a shallow foxhole near the Bailey Bridge, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled like mildew and diesel, staring at the stars. The German shelling had stopped an hour ago, leaving the beachhead in eerie silence. But something bothered him. Earlier that day, he had crawled beneath the bridge to inspect the welds. Routine check. He ran his hands along the main girder, tapping every few inches with a small steel hammer, listening. Most of the joints rang clear, solid. Good steel, good welds, but one section sounded wrong. Not a crack, not yet, just a dullness. A dead spot where the metal didn't vibrate the way it should. Danny marked it with chalk, then climbed topside and reported it to Captain Hale. Hale barely looked up from his paperwork. "Kovacs, that bridge was certified by Corps engineers. It's rated for class 40 loads, it's fine." "Sir, I'm not saying it's going to collapse. I'm saying there's stress in that joint. We should reinforce it before—" "Before what? Before you find another imaginary problem?" Hale sighed. "Corporal, I appreciate your diligence, I do. But we have 18 bridges to maintain across this beachhead, and I've got half the engineers I need. If I let you reinforce every joint that sounds wrong, we'd never get anything done." Danny tried again. "Sir, if we wait until it cracks—" "It won't crack. The bridge is sound. Dismissed." Danny saluted and left. But the dead spot haunted him. That night, he returned to the bridge with Private Eddie Moran and a lantern. They crawled beneath the span. Danny tapped the joint again. Still wrong. He studied it closely. The weld looked fine. But under the lantern light, he saw it. A hairline fracture, barely visible, running along the heat-affected zone where the steel had been welded. It was small, maybe 2 inches, propagating slowly through the lower flange of the girder. In a week, it might grow to 4 inches. In 2 weeks, 6. Eventually, it would reach critical length, and the girder would fail suddenly, catastrophically. And if it failed during a crossing, men would die. Danny sat back on his heels thinking. He could report it again. Hale would dismiss it again. He could go over Hale's head, but that would take days. and by then the fracture would be worse. Or he could fix it himself, not by the book, not with official materials or approved procedures, but with what he had, using what he knew. It was a gamble. If anyone found out, it would be unauthorized modification of a certified structure, court-martial offense. But if he did nothing and the bridge failed, men like Jimmy Delgado would die. Danny reached into his jacket and pulled out his father's tape measure. He ran his thumb over the worn brass casing, remembering Istvan's voice. Check 3 times. Trust the metal, not the men. He looked at Eddie. You good at keeping secrets? Eddie, wide-eyed, nodded. Good, Danny said, because we're about to break every rule in the manual. The flaw wasn't Danny's fault. It belonged to the men who built the bridge in the first place. On February 16, 1944, the same day the Germans launched their massive counterattack, engineers from the 36th Engineer Combat Regiment were ordered to span the Mussolini Canal near Aprilia. They had 36 hours, no more. The ground was wrong from the start. Standard procedure required soil testing, compaction analysis, and foundation stabilization. But there was no time. German shells were falling every 15 minutes. The engineers just drove pilings into the mud, bolted down base plates, and started stacking Bailey panels as fast as they could unload them from trucks. The welds were done in darkness, under tarps, by exhausted men who hadn't slept in 2 days. Some joints were welded hot and fast. Others were bolted and skipped entirely. Inspections were visual only. No x-rays, no load tests, no time for anything except, does it look solid? When they finished, the bridge looked perfect. Regulation height, proper spacing, clean lines. Captain Hale certified it, signed the paperwork, stamped it Class 40, but the Anzio mud had other plans. Clay soil, saturated with winter rain, doesn't stay still. It shifts, settles, compresses unevenly. Every time a vehicle crossed the bridge, the weight pushed down on the pilings. The pilings sank, not much, just millimeters, but enough to twist the frame slightly, stressing joints that were supposed to remain static. Over 10 days, microscopic cracks formed in the welds. Rivets loosened. The main girder, the backbone of the structure, began to fatigue. By February 26th, the fracture was visible. By February 27th, it was 2 inches long, and no one in command wanted to hear about it. Danny spent the night of February 27th scavenging. He and Eddie Moran moved through the wreckage-strewn beachhead like ghosts, searching for materials. They passed burned-out trucks, shattered artillery pieces, and the skeletal remains of a German freight train that had been bombed 2 weeks earlier. Near the rail yard at Aprilia, Danny found what he needed: German rail sections. Heavy steel, high carbon content, rolled into the distinctive I-beam profile used for train tracks. Each section was about 4 feet long, weighing close to 90 pounds. The metal was scarred and pitted from the bombing, but structurally sound. "What are we doing with railroad tracks?" Eddie whispered. "Reinforcing a bridge," Danny said, running his hand along the steel. He tapped it 3 times with his hammer. It rang clear, good metal. They loaded 2 sections onto a handcart and wheeled them back through the darkness, moving slowly to avoid drawing attention. German observers in the Alban Hills had night vision scopes. Any noise, any movement could bring down artillery. Back at the bridge, Danny lowered the rail sections into the mud beneath the span. Then he went looking for cable. He found it near a crashed C-47 transport plane, half buried in a ditch. The aircraft had been shot down 3 days earlier, its fuselage crumpled like paper. But the control cables, steel wire rope, braided 6I-19 configuration, rated for high tension, were intact. Danny cut 30 feet of cable using bolt cutters liberated from a supply depot. He coiled it carefully, tested the ends for fraying, and carried it back. The last pieces came from a destroyed ammunition dump, U-bolts, steel strapping, and a handful of hardened bolts still in their shipping crate. By 2 a.m., Danny had everything he needed. By 4 a.m., he had started building. The splice was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Danny positioned the 2 rail sections parallel to the cracked girder, one on each side, forming a 3-layer sandwich: rail, girder, rail. The rails acted as external reinforcement, carrying load away from the fractured weld. He drilled holes through all 3 layers using a hand-cranked drill. Each hole took 5 minutes. His shoulders burned. His hands blistered, but he kept drilling. Then he inserted U-bolts through the holes and tightened them down with a wrench, compressing the sandwich. The bolts squeezed the 3 pieces of steel together, closing the fracture and preventing it from spreading. Next came the cable. Danny wrapped the aircraft cable around the entire assembly, looping it tight like a bandage around a wound. He tensioned the cable using a makeshift block and tackle rig, pulling it so tight the strands hummed. The cable served two purposes. First, it added circumferential compression, squeezing the splice even tighter. Second, it distributed load across the length of the reinforcement, preventing stress concentration at any single point. Finally, Danny wrapped the entire splice in steel strapping, thin bands of metal scavenged from ammo crates, and welded the ends shut using a small acetylene torch. The strapping held everything in place and added a final layer of redundancy. When he finished, the splice was ugly, rough, improvised, a patchwork of scavenged materials held together by desperation and geometry. But it was strong. Danny tapped it 3 times. The sound rang clear, solid, true. He covered the splice with a canvas tarp, then shoveled mud over it to hide the modification. From the surface, the bridge looked exactly the same. No one would know what he'd done, unless it failed. Morning came too fast. At 7 a.m. on February 28th, Danny was washing mud off his hands in a helmet filled with cold water when Sergeant Ben Kowalski walked up. Kowalski was a combat engineer from Detroit, 10 years older than Danny, with a thick neck and a skeptical squint. He'd been building bridges since before the war and didn't trust anyone under 30. "Kovacs," he said, nodding toward the bridge. "You been working nights again?" Danny dried his hands. "Just checking the welds. In the middle of the night? Best time. Quiet. No distractions." Kowalski grunted. He walked to the edge of the bridge and stared down at the canvas tarp covering Danny's splice. "What's under there?" "Nothing. Just covering some exposed metal. Keeps the moisture off." Kowalski nudged the tarp with his boot. "You sure about that?" Danny's heart rate spiked, but he kept his face neutral. "Yes, Sergeant." Kowalski stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "You're a strange one, Kovacs. You know that?" "Yes, Sergeant." Later that morning, Danny overheard 2 other engineers talking near the mess tent. "You hear about Kovacs? Kid's been sneaking around the bridge at night. What's he doing? Who knows? Probably jerking off to a field manual." Laughter. "I heard he thinks the bridge is gonna collapse. Told Hale we need to rebuild it." "Rebuild it? With what?" "We got 12 other bridges to maintain and half the steel we need." "Exactly. Kid's paranoid. Sees problems that aren't there. Well, if he's so worried, maybe he should design his own bridge. Call it the Kovacs Special. Hold it together with bubble gum and prayers." More laughter. Danny said nothing. He just kept walking. But that afternoon, when Captain Hale inspected the bridge one final time before the attack, Danny tried again. "Sir, I really think we should delay the crossing until we can reinforce." Hale cut him off. "Corporal, I've had enough. The bridge is certified. It's been carrying traffic for 10 days without incident. I don't need you inventing problems." "Sir, it's not invented. The fracture is real. It's growing." Hale's face reddened. "Are you questioning my competence?" "No, sir. I'm questioning the manual. It doesn't account for Anzio mud. The ground is shifting and the stress—" "Enough!" Hale stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Kovacs, I know you're a good engineer, but you need to understand something. In war, we don't have time for perfect. We have time for good enough. That bridge is good enough. If you can't accept that, maybe you're in the wrong job." Danny wanted to argue. He wanted to show Hale the measurements, the calculations, the evidence, but he knew it wouldn't matter. So he saluted, turned, and walked away. That night, lying in his foxhole, Danny thought about his father. Istvan Kovacs had died in 1941, crushed when a crane cable snapped on a Pittsburgh bridge site. The cable had looked fine. It was certified, inspected, approved, but someone had rushed. Someone had guessed. Someone had hoped. And Istvan paid the price. Danny pulled his father's tape measure from his pocket. He ran his thumb over the worn brass casing, checked 3 times. Trust the metal, not the men. Somewhere in the darkness, a Sherman tank engine rumbled to life. The attack was 12 hours away. And under the Bailey Bridge, hidden beneath mud and canvas, Danny's splice waited. 5:56 a.m. Danny dropped to his knees in the mud beneath the Bailey Bridge and tore away the canvas tarp. The splice lay exposed. 2 sections of German railroad track clamped around the fractured girder, wrapped tight with aircraft cable that gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light. Steel strapping bound the assembly like surgical sutures. It looked brutal, improvised, wrong. But the fracture, the 12-inch crack that had haunted Danny for 3 days, was invisible now, compressed shut by 90 pounds of scavenged steel and tensioned cable. Eddie Moran scrambled down beside him, breathing hard. "Danny, is it gonna hold?" Danny ran his hand along the splice. Cold, solid. He tapped it 3 times with his hammer. Ring. Ring, ring, clear, no dead spots, no vibration damping. The metal sang true. "I don't know," Danny said quietly. Above them, Captain Hale's voice cut through the fog. "Kovacs, we're out of time." Danny climbed topside. The eastern approach was chaos. 12 Sherman tanks sat in column, engines growling, exhaust smoke mixing with the fog. Behind them, infantry crouched in ditches, waiting for the armor to clear the way. Artillery thunder rolled across the beachhead, American guns firing prep barrages, German guns answering. Lieutenant Frank Rossi stood beside the lead tank, checking his watch. "Kovacs, it's 5:57. We cross in 3 minutes, yes or no?" Danny looked at the bridge, at the splice hidden beneath, at Rossi's face, young, tired, trusting. He thought about Jimmy Delgado, drowning in a half-track because someone rushed. He thought about his father, crushed because someone guessed. He pulled his father's tape measure from his pocket, held it for a moment, then slipped it back. "Send them," Danny said. Rossi nodded and climbed into his tank. The turret hatch clanged shut. Captain Hale stepped close, lowering his voice. "Kovacs, if this bridge fails—" "I know, sir. You'll be buried under it." "I know." Hale stared at him, then nodded once. "Get below. Watch that girder. If you see anything wrong, you signal abort. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Danny dropped beneath the bridge. Eddie followed. They crouched in freezing water, staring up at the splice. Above, the first Sherman's engine roared. 5:58. The tank rolled forward, slow, careful, treads crunching gravel. Danny watched the splice. The cable strands were perfectly still. The tank's front end touched the bridge. 33 tons pressing down on steel designed for 40. The bridge groaned, a low, deep sound that vibrated through the water. The splice held. The Sherman advanced. 10 feet, 20, halfway across. The cable began to hum, a high-pitched vibration as tension distributed through the braided strands. Danny held his breath. The hum was good. It meant the splice was carrying load, sharing stress with the girder. The tank reached the far side, cleared the bridge. Danny exhaled. "One down," Eddie whispered. 11 to go. The second Sherman rolled on, heavier this time. The bridge sagged 2 inches, a visible deflection. Water sloshed against Danny's legs. The splice groaned. One of the U-bolts shifted slightly, metal scraping against metal. Danny's heart hammered. "Hold," he whispered. "Hold." The tank crossed. The bridge rebounded. 2 down. Third tank. Fourth. Fifth. With each crossing, the splice compressed tighter. The cable strands stretched microscopically, elongating under load. Danny watched for signs of failure. Fraying, slippage, sudden movement. Nothing. The splice was doing exactly what he'd designed it to do. Then the 6th Sherman rolled on, and everything changed. The crack came first, not from the splice, from somewhere else. A sharp metallic snap, like a rifle shot, echoed beneath the bridge. Danny's head whipped around, searching. There, on the western pier, one of the original anchor bolts had sheared clean through. The bolt head lay in the mud, still vibrating. The bridge twisted slightly, rotating a few degrees on its foundation. The 6th Sherman, halfway across, lurched to one side. Its left tread scraped the edge of the deck plating. "Jesus," Eddie breathed. Danny scrambled to the western pier. The bolt failure had shifted the load distribution. Now the splice was carrying more weight than he'd calculated, maybe 60% of the tank's mass instead of 40. The cable strands stretched visibly. One strand, just one, began to fray, individual wires popping loose with tiny pings. "Kovacs!" Hale's voice from above. "What was that noise?" "Anchor bolt failure, west side," Danny shouted back. "Bridge is twisting. Can it hold?" Danny stared at the fraying cable. 7 strands left. If another broke, the splice would lose 20% of its capacity. The girder would take the full load. The fracture would propagate. The bridge would collapse. "I don't know. We have 6 more tanks." Danny looked at Eddie, at the splice, at the cable slowly coming apart. Then he made a decision. "Stop the column," Danny yelled. "Hold position." Above, chaos. Tank commanders shouting, infantry calling questions. German artillery shells landing closer, 200 yards, then 100. The enemy had spotted the crossing. They were bracketing the approach. Danny pulled his tape measure and measured the cable elongation, 8%. Maximum safe elongation for aircraft cable was 10%. After that catastrophic failure, he had 2% of margin, maybe. "Eddie, we need to reinforce the cable." "Now." "With what?" Danny scanned the area. His eyes landed on a coil of barbed wire lying in the mud. Leftover from a defensive position, not rated for structural load, but it was steel. It was there. "That," Danny said, pointing. They grabbed the wire and wrapped it around the splice, layering it over the fraying cable. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't engineered. But it added mass, distributed tension, bought time. Danny tested it. The wire held. "Hale," Danny shouted. "Resume crossing, but space them out. 30 seconds between tanks." "We don't have 30 seconds. German guns are zeroing in." As if to punctuate the point, an 80mm shell screamed overhead and exploded 50 yards beyond the bridge. Water geysered into the air. Shrapnel hissed through the fog. 20 seconds then, Danny yelled, but no faster. The 7th Sherman rolled on. The splice groaned. The cable stretched to 9%. The barbed wire Danny had added bit into the steel strapping, holding, barely. Tank 7 cleared, 8th, 9th. With each crossing, Danny held his breath. With each crossing, the splice compressed tighter, the cable stretched thinner, the margin for error shrank. 10th tank, another anchor bolt sheared. The bridge dropped 3 inches on the eastern side. The 10th Sherman tilted violently. For a moment, Danny thought it would roll off the edge, but the driver compensated, gunned the engine, and powered through. The splice held. 11th tank. The cable was at 8% elongation. Individual wire strands were breaking now. Pop, 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 like firecrackers under the deck. One more, Eddie whispered. Just one more. The 12th Sherman, Lieutenant Rossi's tank, advanced. German artillery landed 30 yards away. The concussion wave rocked the bridge. Mud sprayed across Danny's face. The splice shuddered. The cable stretched to 9%. The Sherman was halfway across. One more cable strand broke, then another. Danny pressed his hands against the splice as if he could hold it together through will alone. The tank's rear treads touched the far bank. The cable hit 10% elongation and held. The Sherman cleared the bridge. Danny collapsed against the girder, shaking. Eddie sat in the mud, breathing hard, staring at the splice. Above, engines roared as the 12 Shermans formed up and charged north toward Aprilia. The bridge groaned one last time, then settled, silent. Captain Hale appeared at the edge, looking down. His face was pale. "Kovacs, what the hell did you do down there?" Danny stood slowly. His legs felt like water. "My job, sir." Hale stared at the splice, now fully visible, covered in mud, barbed wire, and fraying cable. "That's not in any manual, I know. If that had failed, it didn't." Hale shook his head slowly, then quietly. "Get topside, Corporal. You look like you're about to pass out." Danny climbed up. Eddie followed. The sun was rising. Fog burned away. Somewhere north, the sound of tank cannons echoed. The breakout had begun. Danny sat on the eastern bank, covered in mud, hands blistered, every muscle screaming. Lieutenant Rossi's voice crackled over the radio. "Bridge team, this is lead tank. We're through. Engaging enemy at Aprilia. Whatever you did back there, it worked." Captain Hale picked up the handset. "Copy that, lead tank. Good hunting." He set the radio down and turned to Danny. "Kovacs, I need to know. How long have you been working on that splice?" 3 days, sir. Without permission." "Yes, sir." Hale was quiet for a long time. Then, "You saved the mission. You know that, right?" Danny didn't answer. He just stared at the bridge. At the splice that had held 400 tons, at the cable that hadn't quite broken, at the line between catastrophe and survival, measured in fractions of a percent. "I just didn't want anyone else to die," Danny said finally. 3 days after the crossing, Danny Kovacs stood at attention in a sandbagged command post, facing a review board. 2 majors, 1 lieutenant colonel, all engineers, all looking at photographs of his splice like it was evidence in a murder trial. "Corporal Kovacs," the lieutenant colonel said. "You modified a certified bridge without authorization. You used non-standard materials. You circumvented the chain of command. Do you understand these are court-martial offenses?" "Yes, sir." "Then why did you do it?" Danny hesitated. "Because the bridge was failing, sir, and no one was listening." One of the majors leaned forward. "Captain Hale says you reported the fracture. He says he investigated and determined it was within tolerance." "With respect, sir, it wasn't. The fracture was propagating. I measured it daily. It would have failed under armor load. But you couldn't know that for certain." "I knew the metal, sir. I trusted what it told me." The room fell silent. Then the door opened. Lieutenant Frank Rossi walked in, still in his field uniform, smelling of cordite and diesel. "Sirs," he said, saluting sharply. "Permission to speak." The lieutenant colonel frowned. "Lieutenant, this is a closed hearing." "I know, sir, but I'm the man who would have died if that bridge failed. And I think that matters." The officers exchanged glances. The lieutenant colonel nodded. "Go ahead." Rossi turned to face the board. That splice held 12 tanks, 400 tons, under German artillery fire. If Corporal Kovacs hadn't built it, we'd have lost armor, lost the crossing, maybe lost the breakout. "He saved my life, he saved my crew, he saved the mission." One of the majors cleared his throat. "Lieutenant, we appreciate that. But regulations exist for a reason. If every soldier modified equipment without approval, then maybe more of us would come home alive," Rossi said quietly. The lieutenant colonel studied Danny. "Corporal, did you document your work? Calculations? Load tests?" No, sir, I didn't have time. So you gambled. Danny met his eyes. Yes, sir, I gambled that my engineering was better than doing nothing. Another long silence. Finally, Captain Hale entered. His face was tight. He set a folder on the table. Sirs, I've reviewed the splice with Corps engineers. They cut samples, ran metallurgical tests, analyzed the load distribution. He paused. Kovacs's design exceeds the original bridge rating. His improvised reinforcement is sounder than the certified structure. The lieutenant colonel opened the folder, studied the data, looked at Danny. No charges, he said finally. But Corporal Kovacs, don't ever do this again without reporting through proper channels. Understood? Yes, sir. Dismissed. Outside, Rossi clapped Danny on the shoulder. You just got away with saving my ass. Danny managed a tired smile. Glad it worked, Frank. Worked? Hell, they're already copying it. Engineers at the southern crossings are asking how you did it. By June 1944, the Kovacs splice, as it became known in unofficial field reports, appeared in Army Corps of Engineers technical bulletins, not by name, just emergency reinforcement technique, using salvaged rail section and tension cable. The official manuals added a section, field expedient bridge repair under combat conditions. Danny never saw a copy. He was transferred north after Rome fell, building bridges across the Arno River, then into France. He never spoke about Anzio. When asked, he'd shrug. Just did the job. The war ended. Danny came home to Pittsburgh in November 1945. He married a girl named Helen from the old neighborhood, got a job as a bridge inspector for the city, had 3 kids, lived quietly. He kept his father's tape measure in a drawer, wrapped in oilcloth. In 1951, a young civil engineer named Thomas Ward was reviewing city bridge records when he found a notation in Danny's handwriting: reinforcement splice, compression plus tension distribution. See Anzio technique. Ward approached Danny in the field office. Mr. Kovacs, what's the Anzio technique? Danny looked up from his blueprints. Something I did in the war. Nothing special. Can you show me? Danny sketched it on a napkin. Ward stared. This is brilliant. Why isn't this in the textbooks? Because I made it up in the mud, Danny said. Real engineers don't do that. Real engineers solve problems, Ward replied. You saved lives with this. Danny folded the napkin and handed it back. Just did what the metal told me to do. Danny Kovacs died in 1989. Heart attack, age 69, in his backyard workshop. He was rebuilding a lawnmower engine. At his funeral, Lieutenant Frank Rossi, now 71, retired, walking with a cane, stood and spoke. Danny never asked for credit, never wore his medals, but I'm alive because he refused to follow a bad order. My kids exist because he trusted his hands more than a manual. That's the man we're burying today. In 1998, Danny's grandson Michael was cleaning out the attic when he found an old Bible. Inside, tucked between Psalms and Proverbs, was a letter on Army letterhead dated March 15, 1944. For initiative and engineering skill under fire in the modification of critical infrastructure, resulting in the successful crossing of armored elements and the preservation of operational objectives, Corporal Daniel Kovacs is hereby commended. Beneath it, a hand-drawn diagram, the splice, precise measurements in faded pencil. Michael called his mother. Grandpa never told us about this. She smiled. He never told anyone. That's who he was. Today, at the U.S. Army Engineer School at Fort Leonard Wood, there's a display case. Inside, a section of steel rail, a length of aircraft cable, and a photograph of a muddy bridge at Anzio. The plaque reads, Field Improvisation Under Fire, CPL Daniel Kovacs, 1944. No Hollywood ending, no parade, just a name, a bridge, and a question that still matters. When the manual fails and lives hang in the balance, do you follow orders into disaster, or do you trust what you know and build something new? Danny Kovacs answered with steel, cable, and 3 taps of a hammer, and 400 tons of armor rolled home because of it. What would you have done in his place? Share this story. Honor the forgotten builders.